They actually did it. They sank my goddamn boat. I stood on my dock, the early morning mist curling off the lake, my lake, and stared at the partially submerged ruin of what was once the Tranquility. This wasn't just vandalism. This was a declaration of war from the Homeowners Association, a war they were about to learn they were spectacularly unequipped to fight because they'd forgotten, or more likely arrogantly ignored, one very crucial detail about who controlled the water their precious little kingdom was built beside, and I was about to teach them the real meaning of being up a creek without a paddle. It all started, as these things often do, with a piece of paper. Not a friendly note, mind you, but an officious, condescending demand slipped into my mailbox. I'd lived on this land for 20 years, long before the Lakeside Pines Gated Community, a pretentious name for a cluster of oversized, cookie-cutter houses, had even broken ground on the far side of the water. My property encompassed the entirety of Serpentine Lake, a beautiful, rambling body of water fed by the Archer River, and, critically, the Archer River Dam a few miles upstream. My grandfather had bought the whole tract, dam included, back in the 50s as a wilderness retreat. Seeing the potential for hydroelectric power that never quite materialized commercially, but left our family with an incredible asset and a deep connection to the land. I'd inherited it all, the responsibility and the solitude, and for years, it had been my sanctuary. The Tranquility, my meticulously maintained classic wooden runabout, was my pride and joy, moored at my private dock, a silent companion on countless quiet evenings, spent watching the sunset paint the water gold. The new development, a cancerous sprawl of beige stucco and HOA regulations, had only been fully occupied for about 18 months, and already, their sense of entitlement was palpable. This first letter, emblazoned with the Lakeside Pines HOA crest, a strangely aggressive-looking pine cone, stated that an unapproved watercraft was negatively impacting the aesthetic uniformity and property values of their community. It demanded I remove my boat from the lake within 7 days or face further action. I remember laughing, actually laughing out loud, thinking it was a prank. My boat? On my lake? Impacting their property values? The sheer audacity was breathtaking. I walked over to my filing cabinet, pulled out the meticulously preserved deeds and surveys for my land, highlighting the clear delineation that the entire lake, its bed, and the shoreline up to the high water mark on all sides was mine. I even had the original purchase agreement for the dam. I photocopied the relevant sections, attached a polite, almost overly patient note explaining that they were mistaken, that the lake was private property, and that my boat was well within its rights to be exactly where it was. I hand-delivered it to the security guard at their ostentatious gate, assuming that would be the end of it. A simple misunderstanding, easily cleared up. Oh, how naive I was. About a week later, the response came, not from a faceless committee, but signed by a Brenda Mulroney, HOA president. Brenda, I would soon learn, was the high priestess of petty tyranny, a woman whose entire sense of self-worth seemed to be derived from enforcing arbitrary rules upon others. Her letter dismissed my documents as inconclusive and likely outdated, reiterated the demand for removal, and tacked on a $50 non-compliance fee. There was no offer to meet, no request for further clarification, just a doubling down on her ridiculous stance. It was then I realized this wasn't about a boat, or aesthetics, or even property values. This was about power. Brenda Mulroney, from her perch in Lakeside Pines, had decided that my ancestral lake was an extension of her fiefdom, and I was merely a stubborn peasant who needed to be brought to heel. The calm I usually felt by the water began to curdle into a slow, simmering annoyance. This wasn't going to be simple at all. The second letter from Brenda Mulroney, HOA president, arrived with an increased fine, now $100 for continued non-compliance, and an added penalty for unauthorized dock structures, referring to the dock my grandfather had built with his own hands 50 years prior. It was accompanied by a grainy photograph of my boat, taken from a considerable distance, probably with a telephoto lens from someone's deck on the HOA side. The arrogance was infuriating. They were trespassing on my visual privacy to enforce rules that didn't apply to me on a lake they didn't own. My initial amusement had long since evaporated, replaced by a steely resolve. I called my lawyer, Arthur Jenkins, a man whose calm demeanor belied a mind like a steel trap when it came to property rights and local ordinances. Arthur had handled my father's estate and knew my holdings intimately. When I explained the situation, I could almost hear him smile through the phone. "Brenda Mulroney, you say?" He chuckled. "She's making quite a name for herself. Apparently, she tried to fine old Mr. Henderson last month because his prize-winning roses were too ostentatious and not in the HOA's approved color palette. He advised me to meticulously document everything, every letter, every communication, every perceived act of harassment. He drafted a formal cease and desist letter on his firm's imposing letterhead, citing the specific property laws, attaching copies of my deeds again, this time certified, and warning the HOA against further harassment, trespassing, or attempts to levy baseless fines. We sent it via registered mail, return receipt requested. For about 2 weeks, there was silence. I allowed myself a flicker of hope that perhaps legal letterhead had intimidated Brenda into backing down. I should have known better. Brenda was not the type to be deterred by facts or laws when they conflicted with her desires. The next communication wasn't a letter. It was a visit. I was out tending my vegetable garden, a good 100 yards from the lakefront, when I saw Brenda Mulroney herself, flanked by 2 sour-faced men I later learned were her husband, Kevin, and another board member, a stooge named Gary, marching down my private driveway as if they owned the place. Brenda was a woman who seemed perpetually corseted, both literally and figuratively, her face set in a permanent moue of disapproval. She was holding a clipboard like a weapon. "Mr. Harrison," she announced, her voice carrying with the shrill confidence of someone utterly convinced of their own righteousness. "We've come to discuss the continued violation of community standards regarding your watercraft." I put down my trowel, wiping my hands on my jeans, and met them halfway. "Mrs. Mulroney," I said, keeping my voice level, "there is no violation. This is private property. My boat is on my lake. Your HOA has no jurisdiction here. Your lawyer should have made that clear to you after receiving Mr. Jenkins' letter." Kevin, a fleshy man who looked like he was poured into his polo shirt, puffed out his chest. "Now see here, your lawyer friend doesn't scare us. This lake is a shared resource. We all have to look at it." "Shared?" I nearly choked. "Shared how exactly?" I asked. "Did the HOA contribute to the dam maintenance that keeps this lake full? Did you pay part of the property taxes on the several hundred acres that constitute this lakebed and surrounding shores? No? Then it's not shared. It's mine." Brenda flipped a page on her clipboard. "Our bylaws clearly state that all water features visible from Lakeside Pines properties are subject to aesthetic review and regulation. Your bylaws," I said, my patience wearing thin, "are applicable to the properties within Lakeside Pines, not an inch beyond. You cannot extend your rules onto my land any more than I can dictate the color you paint your house, though frankly, that shade of beige is an affront to nature." Gary, who had been silent up to this point, piped up, "We're just trying to maintain a certain standard, for everyone's enjoyment. My enjoyment is being severely curtailed by your harassment," I countered. "This is your final warning. Leave my property and cease these baseless claims. Any further action from you or the HOA will be met with legal recourse for trespassing and harassment." Brenda's face tightened. "You'll be hearing from us, Mr. Harrison. This isn't over." They turned and marched back up my driveway, indignation radiating from them. The audacity of them, physically coming onto my land to deliver their threats, was a new level of provocation. Arthur advised sending another, sterner letter, this time specifically warning against trespassing, and I installed a few more security cameras, discreetly, along my property line and near the dock. The fines continued to arrive in the mail, each one more ludicrous than the last. Improper shoreline maintenance, for a patch of natural wildflowers Brenda probably thought were weeds. Unapproved dock coloration. It was weathered wood, for heaven's sake. I filed them all, along with detailed notes of the Mulrooney trespass. The peace of my sanctuary was gone, replaced by a constant, low-level anxiety, a feeling of being under siege. I found myself scanning the far shore more often, wondering what fresh nonsense Brenda was concocting in her suburban fortress. The thought of the dam, upstream, silent and powerful, began to occupy more of my thoughts. It was a tool, a responsibility, but also a tremendous leverage, if it ever came to that. I still hoped it wouldn't. The sinking of the Tranquility was a violation that transcended all their previous pettiness. It was a violent act, a desecration. I discovered it just after dawn. I'd gone down for my usual early morning coffee by the lake, a ritual that normally set a peaceful tone for my day. But the sight that greeted me sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated fury through my veins. My beautiful boat, my meticulously cared-for wooden classic, was listing heavily to starboard, its elegant lines ruined, the water lapping halfway up its hull. Its mooring lines hadn't just been untied, they'd been cleanly cut. A quick, heartbroken inspection from the dock revealed more than just negligence. Prying open the engine hatch, I found the seacocks deliberately opened. Someone hadn't just wanted my boat adrift, they had wanted it sunk. This was calculated. This was malicious. This was Brenda Mulrooney's doing, I had no doubt. The calm I had struggled to maintain shattered completely. This was no longer about aesthetic uniformity or misplaced authority. This was criminal damage, a direct physical attack on my property and, by extension, on me. I immediately called the sheriff's department. Deputy Wallace, a young officer who seemed more bored than concerned, eventually arrived. He took a cursory look, scribbled some notes, and asked if I had any enemies. Just an overzealous HOA president named Brenda Mulrooney. I told him, explaining the ongoing harassment, the letters, the fines, their trespass. I showed him the cut ropes. Deputy Wallace, however, seemed distinctly unimpressed. HOA disputes, huh? We get a lot of those, he said with a sigh, as if a deliberately scuttled boat was on par with a disagreement over lawn gnome placement. Probably just some kids. Or maybe you forgot to close those valve things properly. The dismissal in his tone was galling. He promised to ask around, but exuded an air of nothing to see here. I knew then that official channels were unlikely to yield any justice. Brenda and her cronies would hide behind a veneer of community respectability, and the local constabulary seemed to have little appetite for confronting them. After Deputy Wallace departed, leaving me with a worthless incident report number, my mind raced. Anger warred with a cold, gathering determination. They wanted my boat gone. They had made it gone. What they failed to comprehend was the scale of my resources, the depth of my connection to this place, and the lengths to which I would go when pushed this far. I retrieved the memory card from the security camera I'd installed overlooking the dock. My heart pounded as I inserted it into my computer. The footage was grainy, shot in infrared, but clear enough. Around 2:00 a.m., two figures approached the dock. One was shorter, stockier, with a distinctive gait I'd seen marching down my driveway, Brenda. The other was taller, bulkier, almost certainly her husband, Kevin. They fumbled with the ropes. Then Kevin, with what looked like a wrench or pliers, leaned into the boat, clearly working on something near the waterline. Brenda stood by, occasionally pointing. They were there for maybe 10 minutes, then scurried away like the vermin they were. I saved multiple copies of the video, a cold smile finally touching my lips. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was proof. It wasn't kids. It was the HOA president and her husband deliberately, methodically sinking my boat. My lawyer, Arthur, was incandescent when I showed him the footage. This is beyond outrageous. This is a criminal act, plain and simple. We'll take this to the DA, he fumed. But as we discussed it, a darker, more satisfying idea began to form in my mind. The DA might prosecute. Eventually. They might get a fine, maybe probation. It wouldn't be enough. It wouldn't teach them the lesson they so desperately needed to learn. They had messed with my water. They had come onto my land and destroyed my property. They seemed to believe they could act with impunity, that their HOA status conferred upon them some sort of immunity. They felt powerful. I had real power. I had the Archer River Dam. For years, I'd simply maintained it, ensuring its stability, managing the water flow responsibly for the ecosystem downstream. But the dam was also a valve, a colossal tap that controlled the very lifeblood of Serpentine Lake, and by extension, the water levels that lapped at the edges of lakeside pines, which, I knew from my grandfather's old survey maps, was built on what used to be considered seasonal floodplain. Brenda and her ilk thought they were masters of their domain. It was time to remind them who truly governed the waters. The thought was terrifyingly satisfying. They wanted to dictate terms about the lake? Fine. They could have more of it than they ever bargained for. The decision to leverage the Archer River Dam wasn't made in a fit of pique, though the fury over the tranquility was a potent catalyst. It was a cold, calculated response to an escalating pattern of aggression and a criminal act. Brenda and her Lakeside Pines HOA had demonstrated a profound misunderstanding of boundaries, property rights, and basic decency. They saw my lake as a picturesque backdrop for their manicured lives, a resource to be controlled aesthetically, without any comprehension of ownership or respect. They had brought this upon themselves. My first step was meticulous research, revisiting every document I had pertaining to the dam, its original engineering schematics, my grandfather's maintenance logs, and, crucially, the water rights agreements and responsibilities. The dam was old, a relic of a more ambitious industrial era, but solidly built. My family had always been fastidious about its upkeep, recognizing its potential impact. Critically, my grandfather had secured exceptionally broad water management rights, primarily to protect his potential, though never realized, hydroelectric ambitions from downstream claims or upstream diversions. These rights gave me considerable latitude in controlling release rates, especially for necessary maintenance, safety protocols, or prevention of upstream flood risk. The Lakeside Pines development, I recalled from studying newer county zoning maps when they first started building, had been approved with certain floodplain caveats. Their own developers had acknowledged the low-lying nature of some parcels in their environmental impact reports, but clearly, no one in the HOA, least of all Brenda, had ever seriously considered what a sustained high-water event, orchestrated from upstream, could actually mean. My plan began to solidify. I wasn't aiming for a catastrophic, life-endangering deluge. I wanted a slow, inexorable, deeply inconvenient, and very expensive soaking. I wanted to hit their common areas, their precious landscaping, their perfectly paved roads, and, with a bit of precise hydraulic calculation, the lower-lying properties of the most enthusiastic HOA enforcers, especially Brenda Mulroney, whose house, I gleefully noted from public records, was one of the closest to the lake and at a slightly lower elevation. I drove up to the dam control house, a small utilitarian structure perched above the Archer River. It hadn't seen active, large-scale manipulation in years, mostly just minor seasonal adjustments. The air inside was thick with the smell of old grease and damp concrete. I spent the better part of a week there, like a conductor tuning his orchestra before a major performance. I checked the massive manual wheel that operated the main sluice gate, oiled the gears, inspected the seals. I tested the smaller release valves, ensuring they were responsive. I ran calculations on flow rates, consulting old hydrological charts, and estimating the lake's capacity and the likely spread of a sustained increase in water volume. The trigger for my operation would be the next significant rainfall. The weather forecast predicted a series of spring showers in about 10 days. This would provide a veneer of natural plausibility. The dam's increased discharge could be framed as a preemptive safety measure to accommodate the anticipated heavy inflow and reduce stress on the aging structure. A responsible act on paper. I drafted a series of internal memos to file, dated over the preceding months, noting concerns about silt buildup behind the dam, unusual pressure readings, fictional of course, and the need for a controlled flushing event at the next suitable opportunity. Documentation, as Arthur always said, was king. While these preparations were underway, I also ensured the video evidence of Brenda and Kevin sinking my boat was securely backed up in multiple locations, including with Arthur. This was my insurance policy against any potential accusations of malicious intent on my part later. If they dared to point fingers about the water, I had incontrovertible proof of their far more egregious criminal actions. During this period, the HOA, blissfully unaware of the aquatic retribution I was planning, actually had the gall to send me a bill for the removal of hazardous derelict watercraft. Referring to the sunken Tranquility, they had apparently contracted someone to drag the hulk from my mooring, undoubtedly further damaging it, and were now charging me for the privilege. The audacity was almost comical, if I weren't so focused on my impending symphony of sogginess. The bill went straight into my growing Brenda file. I also took some time to subtly observe the Lakeside Pines community from my side of the lake. I noted the locations of their new community pontoon boat, their meticulously manicured lakeside park with its pristine white gazebos, and Brenda's particularly elaborate rose garden that sloped gently towards the water, all prime targets for a little hydraulic redecoration. My internal monologue during this time was a mix of grim satisfaction and focused determination. They had mistaken my quiet enjoyment of my property for weakness. They had mistaken my polite assertions of my rights for an invitation to escalate. They were about to learn, in a very damp and personal way, that some people are best left undisturbed in their tranquility. The old saying about poking a sleeping bear came to mind, only in this case, the bear owned the river. The forecasted rains arrived with a theatrical flourish, starting as a gentle drizzle and building over 2 days into a steady, drumming downpour. It was perfect. The ground was already saturated, the Archer River was beginning to swell naturally, and every resident of Lakeside Pines would be attributing the rising water levels, initially at least, to Mother Nature's bad mood. On the third morning of the rain, with the river running high and fast, I drove up to the Archer River Dam. The air was heavy, the sky a bruised purple. It felt like the world was holding its breath. I had already, officially, logged my intent to perform a controlled maintenance release, due to excessive upstream pressure and anticipated continued precipitation. In accordance with long-standing safety protocols, my paper trail was immaculate. Inside the control house, the roar of the engorged river outside was a dull thunder. I laid out my calculations one last time, double-checking the flow rates I intended to achieve. My goal was a gradual, sustained increase, enough to significantly raise Serpentine Lake over a period of 24 to 48 hours, maximizing the inconvenience and ensuring the water had time to really soak in. I wasn't just opening the floodgates. I was orchestrating a slow, inexorable creep. I put on a heavy-duty rain slicker and gloves, then grasped the large, cold iron wheel of the primary sluice gate. It resisted at first. Stiff from years of only minor adjustments, I put my weight into it, and with a protesting groan of metal and a hiss of releasing pressure, it began to turn. Inch by painstaking inch, I opened the gate wider than it had been in decades. The sound of the water surging through the newly widened gap was immense, a hungry roar that vibrated through the concrete floor. It wasn't a sudden catastrophic torrent, but a powerful controlled augmentation of the already swollen river. Over the next few hours, I made several more trips to the dam, making minute adjustments to the smaller release valves, fine-tuning the outflow. I felt a strange sense of calm, a detached focus. The emotional heat of the initial anger had cooled into a methodical execution of a well-laid plan. Back at my house, which sat on a natural rise well above any conceivable floodline, I used my high-powered binoculars to observe the far side of Serpentine Lake. By late afternoon, the effects were beginning to show. The water, already higher than usual from the rains, was now visibly encroaching on the lower fringes of the Lakeside Pines common areas. The edges of their meticulously manicured lawns were darkening, as the lake stealthily claimed new territory. Their brand new community beach, a tiny strip of imported sand, was shrinking rapidly. By evening, the water was licking at the base of their white gazebos. I could almost imagine the dawning confusion among the residents. Is the lake always this high after a bit of rain? By the next morning, the scene was transforming. The imported beach was gone, submerged entirely. The lower sections of their lakeside walking paths were now shallow canals. The water was creeping up the lawns of the houses closest to the lake, Brenda Mulroney's included. I saw a few figures, tiny in the distance, standing on their decks, pointing and gesticulating. The first hint of panic. My phone remained silent. No angry calls from Brenda yet, which meant they probably still hadn't connected the dots between the rising lake and the crazy recluse upstream who owned the dam. They were likely blaming the county, the rain, anything but their own neighbor whom they had so profoundly wronged. Throughout that day, the water continued its relentless, silent advance. The common boat ramp was underwater. Several of the HOA's ornamental lampposts along the shore looked like lonely lighthouses in a miniature sea. I saw a Lakeside Pines security vehicle attempt to drive down one of the lower access roads, only to stop abruptly as its tires met unexpected water, then slowly reverse. The true beauty of this plan was its deniability, wrapped in the cloak of natural weather and responsible dam management. My safety release was merely exacerbating what the heavens had already started. And I, of course, was carefully logging the necessary ongoing discharge to prevent catastrophic upstream dam failure due to unprecedented rainfall. It was all perfectly legitimate. The calls would start soon, I knew. First to the county, then perhaps, eventually, the dawning horrified realization would turn their attention towards me. But by then, Brenda's prize-winning petunias would be swimming, and her meticulously curated lakeside life would be comprehensively, beautifully damp. The calls began on the second evening of the Great Deluge, as I started to privately call it. Not to me, not yet. Arthur, my lawyer, had a friend in the county engineer's office who gave him a heads up. Apparently, the Lakeside Pines HOA, spearheaded by a frantic Brenda Mulroney, was bombarding the county with demands to know why the lake was attacking them. County officials, citing the unusually heavy rainfall and pointing to my proactive safety releases from the Archer River Dam, my filed paperwork was now their official explanation, essentially told the HOA it was an act of God, exacerbated by unfortunate but necessary upstream water management. The phrase unfortunate but necessary brought a grim smile to my face. The real panic in Lakeside Pines set in on the third day, when the water, which I had been carefully maintaining at its peak elevation by subtly adjusting the dam's outflow to match and slightly exceed the ongoing, though now tapering rainfall, began to seep into basements and crawl spaces. The lower loop road that serviced a dozen or so of the prime lakeside properties, including Brenda's and those of at least two other vocal board members, was now impassable, a murky brown moat. Satellite dishes on some lawns looked like forlorn, partially submerged mushrooms. I watched through my binoculars as a U-Haul truck, presumably summoned by a resident desperate to save belongings, got stuck trying to navigate a flooded cul-de-sac, its driver looking utterly defeated. News vans from a local station had appeared at the entrance to Lakeside Pines, only to be turned away by the HOA's increasingly stressed-looking security guards. The image of Brenda's cherished lakeside rose garden, the one she'd boasted about in the community newsletter, a copy of which a disgruntled HOA resident had once anonymously left in my mailbox, was now a tragic mess of brown water and wilting blooms. Her expensive outdoor furniture, I noted with particular satisfaction, was either floating haphazardly or completely submerged. The vindication was potent, but it was also layered with a profound sense of gravity. I had unleashed a powerful force, and while my aim was property and pride, not people, the disruption was immense. Yet, every pang of that gravity was countered by the memory of the tranquility sinking, the smugness of Brenda's trespass, the relentless stream of insulting demands. They had sowed the wind, and now they were reaping the whirlwind, or in this case, the floodwater. The first direct contact came via Arthur. Brenda, in a sputtering rage, had apparently called him, accusing me of deliberately flooding them. Arthur, cool as ever, calmly reiterated the official county line. Heavy rains, necessary safety releases from an aging dam structure I was responsibly managing. He may have also gently reminded her about the pending investigation into the criminal destruction of my boat, supported by clear video evidence. He said her threats then devolved into incoherent screeching before she slammed the phone down. By day 4, the rain had stopped completely. This was the critical phase for my narrative. I began to slowly, meticulously, reduce the outflow from the dam, logging it as water levels stabilizing, pressure reducing, incremental gate closure initiated. Serpentine Lake began its slow retreat. The water didn't vanish overnight. It receded grudgingly, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation in the lower reaches of Lakeside Pines. A thick layer of mud and silt coated everything the water had touched. Lawns were ruined, plantings were dead, debris from the lake was strewn across once pristine properties. The beautiful white gazebos were stained and reeked of swamp. Roads were buckled and eroded in places. The cleanup would be colossal, the cost astronomical. Insurance adjusters, I imagined, were about to have a field day denying claims based on floodplain exclusions and acts of God. The HOA's communal funds, already likely strained by Brenda's aggressive fining policies and legal saber-rattling, would be obliterated. The investigation, when it inevitably came, was thorough. State dam safety officials and county engineers inspected Archer River Dam. They reviewed my logs, my precautionary memos, the weather data. My story held. An old dam, heavy rains, a responsible owner taking necessary steps to prevent a worse catastrophe. The fact that Lakeside Pines was built on a known floodplain, albeit one that hadn't seen significant water in years, worked in my favor. There were questions, of course, sharp ones. But Arthur had prepped me well, and my narrative was consistent and technically sound. My ownership of the dam and the breadth of my water rights were undeniable. Proving malicious intent in the face of documented safety procedures and unprecedented weather was, as Arthur put it, a very, very steep hill to climb. The focus inevitably shifted to the Lakeside Pines developers and the initial county approvals that had allowed construction in such a vulnerable area. The HOA, predictably, tried to sue me. Arthur met their lawsuit with a countersuit for the destruction of my boat, the harassment, and the infliction of emotional distress, prominently featuring the video of Brenda and Kevin's midnight sabotage. Their lawsuit quietly vanished. The aftermath was, in a word, cleansing, not just for the landscape as the waters finally receded, but for the entire atmosphere surrounding Serpentine Lake. Lakeside Pines was a changed community. The lower-lying homes, including Brenda Mulroney's, were a disaster zone. Many were uninhabitable for weeks, some for months. The beautifully manicured common areas looked like a neglected bog. The cost of repairs, individual and communal, was staggering. Insurance companies, citing various clauses, were reportedly less than generous. The HOA's aggressive bravado had been washed away, replaced by the grim reality of mud-caked carpets and condemned basements. Brenda Mulroney, I heard through the local grapevine, faced a rebellion. Residents, furious at the financial devastation and the realization that her vendetta against me might have, in some karmic way, contributed to their woes, though few likely understood the direct hydraulic link I had orchestrated, demanded her resignation. She apparently clung to her presidency for a few more weeks, issuing defensive statements and trying to blame everyone from the county to climate change, before finally, unceremoniously, stepping down. Her house went up for sale shortly thereafter, listed as is, a testament to her sunken ambitions. Her husband, Kevin, last I saw of him from across the lake, was sadly loading a moving truck. They didn't get their asking price. The charges against them for sinking the Tranquility were eventually pleaded down to misdemeanor vandalism and destruction of property, thanks to the clear video evidence. They received hefty fines, community service, and court-ordered restitution for my boat, which was a total loss. The money was cold comfort for the loss of a vessel with such sentimental value, but it was a tangible symbol of their defeat. I used part of it to commission the building of the Tranquility II, an even more beautiful, custom-built wooden craft. Launching it onto my lake, mooring it at my dock, felt like reclaiming a piece of my soul. The remaining Lakeside Pines residents were notably subdued. The arrogance was gone. There were no more letters about aesthetic uniformity, no more officious demands. Instead, there were furtive glances, perhaps a grudging respect, or maybe just fear. A few of the residents, those living on higher ground who had privately chafed under Brenda's regime, even gave me discreet, knowing smiles or small waves when they saw me out on the water. No one ever mentioned the flood directly to me. No one had to. The evidence of what had happened was etched into their landscape and, I suspected, their collective memory. The legend of the 100-year flood, as some began to call it, conveniently forgetting it had a very human hand guiding it, would serve as a permanent reminder of the folly of overreaching ambition and disrespecting one's neighbors, especially a neighbor who holds the keys to the kingdom, or in this case, the dam. Arthur Jenkins, ever the pragmatist, advised me to maintain my dam management logs with continued diligence. Just in case, he'd said, with a twinkle in his eye. Peace returned to my stretch of Serpentine Lake, a deeper, more satisfying peace than before. It was the peace of a battle won, of justice, albeit unconventional, served. Sometimes, when I'm out on the Tranquility II in the quiet of the evening, watching the water gleam under the setting sun, I glance over at the chastened shoreline of Lakeside Pines. They had wanted to control a piece of my world, to bend it to their will. Instead, the water itself had risen to remind them of the true nature of power, and the importance of knowing whose domain you're treading in. If you're out there dealing with your own version of a power-tripping HOA, remember this: understand your rights, document everything, and never underestimate the satisfying leverage of a well-placed, overwhelming, natural force, or its carefully managed equivalent. Sometimes, you have to make some waves to reclaim your tranquility.